Hello and welcome to the Christiana 321. I am the Christiana. How about them apples? I was listening to the podcast Dear Hank and John this week. It's the episode that came out on April 27th, 2020. If you happen to be watching this in the future and you want to go back and listen to it, they mention that apples of today are way better than the apples they had when they were kids, which would have been the 80s. I wasn't sure from the way they said it if they meant apples were actually different back then or if they were different and they just appreciated apples more than when they were kids. So, I went on a deep dive of the internet, and I'm talking deep dive of the internet to find out what's up. Did apples change? And oh boy, let me tell you what, I know way more about apples than I ever really thought that I would. But if you would like to know more than just what's in this video, you can check out the description for my sources. And yeah, gosh, where to start? A long time ago in a land far away, or at least far away from me, called Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan. Now it's called Almaty, a fruit called Malus sievri. I don't speak Latin, so that might not be the right pronunciation. It's called wild apples grew wild. And that wild apple, when mixed with these other two Malus, Malus orientalis and Malus sylvestris, which were tiny green sour apples, combined to make the apple that eventually became Malus domestica, which is basically what we see as being an apple. It was taken to Rome, and from Rome eventually it made its way to the rest of the European continent and to the Americas. Crossbreeding of the different Maluses in this area of Kazakhstan. Yeah, you got apples of every size, shape, color, taste. They just had a field day. This area is known as the center of diversity for apples. And it was basically undisturbed for a very long time, but we'll get back to that. In the late 18th, early 19th century, John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed, started his quest. If you're familiar with songs and the folklore around Johnny Appleseed, he wanted apples to grow throughout the whole country. He started nurseries in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and in addition to that, he would hand out seedlings to different settlers that were going to other parts of the country. But here's the thing. His apples were gross. Those apples were something that people in the industry call spitters because, well, you take one bite and you spit. They were very sour, but that was okay because they were mostly used for cider, and they made great cider, or okay cider. I'm not really sure where the bar was for their alcoholic beverages back in the day. Growing a specific strain of apple is really difficult because they are heterozygotes, which like humans are heterozygotes, and essentially that means for any given trait you get two different alleles that come in, and then you got to deal with recessive and dominant traits. I'm going to put a video in the description to a crash course episode all about this if you really want to get into how heredity and genetics work. But basically, in order to get a tree clone, you have to do something called grafting, which is where you take a healthy branch of the tree that you want to replicate and you stick it on a little stub of a tree that has healthy roots. Rootstock is what it's called. It was inconclusive from the articles I was seeing whether it mattered what type of tree the rootstock came from, but the tree that you're really cloning is wherever the top branch came from. But back to Johnny. He did not approve of grafting. Trees that he was planting in the nurseries and handing off to random settlers had huge amounts of variety in them. And since they were just getting turned into booze anyway, it didn't matter that they were varied. But also, because of all of that variation, sometimes they accidentally grew some pretty darn delicious apples. In fact, in the 1890s, a particularly panaceous tree started growing in a cider orchard, and the farmer tried to get rid of it a couple of times, but it was not going anywhere. Eventually, it bore fruit, and he entered that fruit into a contest in 1894 at the Stark Brothers farm, where they were trying to find the next great apple. One of the judges bit into it, said, "Oh, delicious!" And that apple then was named Red Delicious. It grew in popularity until about 1980, so almost a century later, when it was the most popular apple in America. During that time, farmers and people interested in the apple industry selectively bred the Red Delicious trees so that they would be even redder. Made it redder, they encouraged its now iconic shape of the thinner dimpled bottom and the bigger top. The shape is really good for stacking. They also bred for a thicker skin, which made it more durable and easier to ship and store for longer periods of time. But through this selective breeding process, they weren't breeding for taste or even really texture. It does not live up to the second half of its name. Biting into a Red Delicious apple sometimes is akin to biting into a baseball glove. So it hit its peak of popularity in the early 1980s, and then it started falling as other strains of apples that have better taste and better eating experiences, like Fuji's or Golden Delicious apples, they started becoming more popular. But Red Delicious still reigned supreme for a while, especially in places like food banks and hospitals, hotel lobbies, and schools, public schools, because they're easy to ship, they stack really well, you can save them for longer than your average apple, and because of the declining demand in the public space, they're pretty cheap. So is this why Hank and John thought that apples weren't that great when they were kids, and now they think that they're better because they were forced to eat Red Deliciouses all the time in school? And now they know the glory of a gala apple? I don't know. I didn't ask them. But I promised you we'd get back to Kazakhstan. We're going back there now. Let's go back to 1929. Things were rough. There's a guy, Nikolai Vavilov, who discovers that Eden, the center of diversity for apples that we were talking about in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, and he was like, "Whoa, look at all these apples! This is crazy!" It's just this giant expansive forest of wild apple trees. Then, in 1941, Nikolai goes to prison because Stalin doesn't like science. If you want me to talk about it at a later video, we can, but basically, Stalin didn't like genetics. Nikolai's in prison. 1943, Nikolai dies in prison. 46 years later, 1989, Anak Jangaliev, who's one of Nikolai's last surviving students, invites a bunch of American scientists to come check out these apples. So the US Department of Agriculture goes to Kazakhstan, collects a bunch of samples, and plants them in a nursery in Geneva. Now there's more than 2,500 varieties of apple trees growing in this nursery. Some of them natural, some of them man-made. So Philip Forstlein, who was at one point the curator of this orchard, commented that a century ago, the world was growing thousands of varieties of apples, and now we're really only growing 5 or 6, with like some twists on them, like a Fuji apple is the grandchild of a Red Delicious apple. We wouldn't have Fujis today except a group of apple fanciers had preserved some Rawls Janet apples, which have a specific gene which allow for late blooming in Japan. The addition of these new old varieties from Kazakhstan allow us to introduce more biodiversity into the apples that we're growing now, which can make better apples, as well as breeders breeding for more than just looks and durability and focusing more on the eating experience. But wait! What if Hank and John were wrong? What if apples are actually worse now than they were in the 80s. A team of researchers in 2013 did a study comparing a study of apples in the 1970s to apples today. Well, 2013, but today. And they found for Fuji apples specifically, the flavor concentration had declined. There is something called malic acid, which gives them their flavor, and there is significantly less of it. So the researchers also noted that during this period between the first study and now, or 2013, the area of Japan that these apples were grown in had actually increased in temperature by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Is there causation? Will climate change make our fruit taste worse? I don't know. I was making the very big assumption of causation rather than just correlation, and I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that yet. At the end of the day, my research was pretty clear. It's difficult to compare apples to apples, especially over long periods of time. If you like this video, make sure to like it. If you would like to see more videos like this, either super deep dives on a particular topic, or if you want more deep dives on apples, because like I said, I found out a lot of stuff. There's so much that's not in this video. Like, there's this guy named Joe Davis who is a bio artist trying to create an actual tree of knowledge. Or the anti-pesticide movement of back in the 80s, and how Meryl Streep affected the agricultural economy of the country. This is super fun. I like doing research projects, apparently, now that they're not being graded for school. So just let me know what topic you'd like to hear about next, or if this was horrible and I should never try and do research again. Have a good night, wash your hands, and wash your apples.